Our last speaker this morning is Bill Hopkin. Bill is Mr. Grazing in Utah. I could just quit his introduction there and that would simplify it, but I'll go ahead and read some of the things he submitted. He was ranch raised in Utah and he spent summers managing cattle on family-owned private summer range. Bill in 1983 was hired as the cattle manager of the 205,000 acre Deseret Land and Livestock Ranch. He became the general manager from 91 to 2004. In 06, was the director of the Utah Grazing Improvement Program. 2013 to present, Bill has worked as a part-time grazing specialist for the Utah Department of Ag and Food and provided many consulting services to private ranchers in Wyoming and Utah. Please welcome Bill Hopkin.
Thank you. Good job, Jason. I'm just, and this is a little out of my wheelhouse, I'm mainly just going to talk kind of about the collaborative itself and the people that were involved and how this kind of come together. As Jason mentioned, we agreed early on that we would operate as a consensus collaborative, and as he also mentioned, we agreed up front with Stephen's guidance to certain rules of conduct. I think it's important that and critical that members of the collaborative are respected among the groups that they represent and are willing to be able to communicate with those constituencies. Kind of interesting that in relationship to the resources that the people have talked about today continually bring up resistance and resilience. It applies to people too. We frequently run into resistance. Jason also mentioned the Utah Forest Restoration Working Group and that was kind of the forebearer of this opportunity, and Jason came to this group as we completed the Aspen Restoration Guidelines and recommended the Monroe Mountain Project as a way to test drive the guidelines. And I think we're very fortunate that he did that, and it was kind of a perfect place to do that. Jason had a list of the participants, and this one I had to steal slides because I'm technically challenged. So this is going to be on two different slides, but I think it's really important the people that are chosen to be in a group like this. We all have opinions and we all have biases, but what is important is that people are willing to listen. And initially there was a significant amount of distrust. There may remain some, even after all of those hours in the basement of the courthouse. But the nice thing is that people were respectful, and Steve saw to that. And we listened, we shared opinions and science and talked about the issues, because what we're talking about is a biological system that has a lot of moving parts and is important to lots of people. So, you know, this was critical. You can see the kind of the people that were involved here, county commissioners, permittees. It was really interesting that these two permittees, one was a cattle permittee and one a sheep permittee, and these were fairly young guys, expected to kind of represent some pretty tough, crusty permittees in their region. And that was a challenge. It's a really important trophy elk area. And so those involved with wildlife had a major responsibility to try and communicate with their constituencies. This was the others that were on here. I need to point out here that something I'm going to be talking a little bit right at the very end, how much we appreciated Stan Kitchen and Paul Rogers. Scientists in the true sense of the word, but had the human skills to be able to help people feel understood, and I, for one, was really appreciative of that. The thing that Jason didn't show was Forest Service folks that we called upon frequently to provide data and history and information, and these folks were always accommodating and did a really good job. And you know, they're people too. They have opinions and they have history. And as Jason mentioned, you know, sometimes that's a struggle. They have the responsibility to manage that thing, and to have a group of folks coming in and kind of telling them how they ought to do it is you know, we have to recognize that is a challenge. At any rate, my hat is off to that group of people, and Jason as the leaders, because they really put a huge amount of work into this thing. You know, they were very professional. They were well led, well organized, and they did their jobs honorably. Jason already showed us a similar slide to this. I won't go through it again, but the group worked through what the desired condition for Monroe Mountain was, and that provide guidance for where we went from there. And we also believed that there were 2 aspen problematic conditions, and that was based on the aspen restoration guidelines. One of those was encroachment from conifer, and the other browsing of new growth. Jason showed a slide. This pie chart puts that in perspective. What's happened to aspen over time. Then the browsing thing was, you know, a real issue. We're tremendous diversity of opinions among the group as to what was eating the aspen sprouts. And in 2013, we established browse transects. Jason showed a picture of the folks reading those. They were read 7 times during the year, and then, as you can see here, we put motion detection cameras on each end of those transects. And thank heaven for Jody Gale, the extension. He went through thousands and thousands of photographs, including hunters and mountain lions. And mountain lions and the hunters didn't eat any aspen sprouts, but he did try hard to separate out the best that he could. And it was an educational experience for the group. I mean, you all know how valuable pictures are, and we sat and watched those for long periods of time, and it was educational and helpful to us, even though you couldn't say it was hard and fast scientific evidence. The other thing that was really interesting is early on we determined that we wanted to know what was the grazing history. And so thanks to Tom Tippett and Vince Pace and Vance Mumford and Gary Besant, they spent hours and hours trying to put together kind of a historical rate of use by AUM. And I think this kind of represented a turning point with the group kind of coming together about the issue of browsing. because people had their own opinions. But this is pretty solid data. And the interesting thing here is this decline in livestock grazing has occurred across the entire state, typically about fourfold on BLM and Forest Service lands since 1940. The interesting thing here was that starting in about 1960, based on this data, big game AUMs exceeded livestock AUMs. And kind of an important realization I think the group came to is that, with livestock, at least you have some level of pretty darn good level of ability to control that. With big game, that's a real challenge. Not only where they are, but when they're there. And so this was an effort that was really helpful, I think, to the group. One thing I wanted to mention, because of that reason, because of the high number of AUMs taken by wildlife, we had the two local biologists and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife on the group, but we knew we had to have the support of more sportsmen in general and the regional RAC and the Wildlife Board. And so the collaborative basically were the ones who dealt with that. Thanks to Stan and Paul and others, came up with browse thresholds as a guideline in how we would deal with that. And then one more thing that I think is important, and Jason brought this up, is folks, we just sort of spun our wheels until we got out on the ground. So in July of 2011, we took a 3-day field trip. And this was a major turning point for the group. You can sit around a table in the basement of the Sevier County Courthouse and have your biases and your opinions and talk over top of each other. When you get out on the ground and see what things really look like, and you're both looking at the same thing, opinions change. And that was a major event, a real opportunity for people not only to look at the resource, talk about what's happening there, but also you just get to know folks better when you're out on the ground. So that was a huge issue. The success of a collaborative is largely dependent on having a qualified facilitator. Special thanks to Steve. Steve made sure that everyone's voice and concerns were not only heard but dealt with. Collaborative participation is not for the weak-kneed or for those so married to ideological positions that they won't listen. Collaborative efforts are not efficient, but they're probably more efficient than management by litigation. And so I hope that we'll be able to get this thing on the ground. With this much gray hair, and this is my last collaborative, so indulge me for providing a few personal comments. We were fortunate with the Monroe Mountain Group to have a few excellent scientists involved who bring honor to the profession. However, I worry that the science is often becoming a matter of opinion rather than a question of sound, repeatable data. I think too often in the public land arena, scientists are hired to create the science that justifies their agenda, and that's on all sides. I've been blessed in my life to know a few really, really good scientists. In my profession, most of those were animal scientists, and frequently the things that they had studied were not hugely controversial. But I noticed some common denominators among those guys and gals. They resisted bias and ideology and the flavor of the month. These scientists possessed powerful observation skills, and they had experience, and they honored experience of others and common sense. One of the things I really appreciated about Stephen was his ability to help the Monroe Mountain Working Group blend the valuable experience of the collaborative members with science and economics. Conclude by, I knew well the director of the BLM under George W. Bush. Some of you know her well too, Kathleen Clark. I was particularly frustrated with BLM when they had the SRM meeting in Casper, Wyoming. And so I offered to buy Kathleen breakfast, and of course she turned me down as far as paying for it because of her position, but we met and I says, Kathleen, I am totally frustrated. What do we do? We have some good plans in Rich County, some things that we want to do that will really help. And she made this statement. She says, well, let me tell you how to work with BLM. She says, figure out how to provide the political cover for them to make the right decision. And, you know, there's a lot of truth to that. So as I conclude and say thanks to Jason, I hope that we were able to do that with this collaborative. And again, I'm not saying that collaboratives are the entire answer, but I do think that they're important because they can help provide political cover if the members of that collaborative are willing to work with their constituencies. Thank you.
Questions for Bill? Over here.
You mentioned that you feel as though some scientists are hired to find the results that are desired by a particular agency. I share that sentiment with you. Have you put any thought into how to resolve that issue? That's not by any means easy to do, but if you thought about it, have you got any ideas?
I don't know that I heard that very well. I have hearing aids.
The question is in regard to scientists being hired to fill a particular agenda. Do you have any suggestions how to prevent that?
Well, I don't think you can prevent it. I'm not sure that you want to. I guess it's just something that I have experienced, you know, sometimes in a negative way. I mean, I had just enjoyed what's been presented here today. And I agree that I think most scientists really try hard to be unbiased and that their data is good and is real. But I think we have to recognize that that isn't always the case. And particularly if you end up in front of an administrative judge over a public land issue, that I think that's a concern. I don't have an answer. I'm sorry.
Good question. Thanks for asking. Any more questions for Bill? Everybody ready for lunch? Oh, we got one more. Sorry, didn't see your hand, Allison.
So I haven't read the EIS, and we already know about what the
You got to talk loud, Allison.
Sorry, Bill. We know a little about the action alternatives, how they differ with mechanical and burning treatments. to the action alternatives and how they address both the domestic and wild grazers that are affecting your aspen regen and improvement problem on Monroe?
So the question was, can you speak to the action alternatives in the grazing improvement on Monroe Mountain?
Only a little bit. You know, Jason would be the right one to ask. The one thing that we did do is we recognized early on, and the collaborative group agreed, which is important, that there were important social, cultural, and economic issues related to livestock grazing on Monroe Mountain, to elk hunting. As you know, it's a major area for ATVs, and we had county commissioners on who that was very important to, and of course it was important to the permittees, it was important to the sportsmen. So we spent a lot of time talking about that. And in relationship to the grazing on Monroe Mountain, in my mind, from my perspective and experience, had really been managed quite well. But we looked at the notion that there were some areas on top of the mountain that really never got an opportunity for a full season's rest, and were usually grazed pretty much at the same time of year every year. So prior to this EIS, we did a grazing. We all agreed that we needed to make some revisions to the grazing management, particularly as we got into implementation, so that we could keep those guys on the mountain and still maintain the integrity of a good grazing strategy. And so we did that. We built some fence, we added some water, and we have ways to measure the impact of that down the road so that we can learn from it. But I don't know if that answers your question, but
Mostly, but any changes to the wild ungulate management as well, the other part of the problem?
So I'll repeat the question for our recording. Any changes to the wild ungulate issue?
and Jason could speak to the specifics of that better than I could, but we had some real trust issues with between permittees and sportsmen and so forth, and we worked our way through that, and thanks to Stan and Paul and others that worked on thresholds. The thing about it, and the reason I showed that bar graph, is that we have the means to deal with the cattle as we do the treatments. I mean, it's just standard procedure that they will not graze in those areas that are treated for at least 2 years and maybe more. The issue is that it's really difficult to control where elk and mule deer are. And so based on these grazing thresholds, the region RAC and the state board of wildlife agreed to those thresholds. And so what will happen is if we exceed those thresholds, they will immediately harvest a bunch of animals. So.
Thank you, Bill. Let's give Bill a big hand.